Ray. Hey, yo, Ray.
Lick. Ooh. Yeah. All right. Adam was black. Part 1. Biblical evidence. We went over that already in the last 2 videos. So today we're looking at demographical evidence. Evidence has to do, we're going to look at the aspect of demographical evidence that we're going to look at is basically the part that deals with migration maps, and those maps basically tell us where people originated from and where they moved to. Okay, so we're going to look at demographic evidence, then we're going to look at paleontological evidence in the next part, forensic evidence from scientific community, technical evidence, genetic evidence. That's going to be all in episode 1. Okay? So for today, in demographical evidence, the first obvious point is that Adam and Eve were the first people. They were the first people in Eden. The second point is that virtually all migration maps start in Africa. So if you look up where did the first people come from, pretty much 9 out of 10, they're going to tell you the first people came from Africa. All right. Some people will say Middle East, but that's a deception because Middle East is not a continent, it's not a country, it's not a state. And so when you're talking about continents, the continent that the majority of all migration maps are going to start with is Africa, and Israel is part of Africa because it's on the African plate, and which we'll explain later. But then also, the indigenous people of all continents were black. Okay, so the first Asians were black. The first people from South America, black. First people from North America, black. First people in Australia, black. First people of Europe, black. We're going to show you all of that. And so if all the continents were started by black people, then that means Adam was black. Okay, that's evidence for the blackness of Adam. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Genesis 1, verse 27. So now, back to point 1. Adam and Eve were the first people in Eden. So the world, when God created the world only had one name, and it was called Eden. There was no Africa. There was no America. Okay, there was no China. None of those names existed. There was only one place named, and that place was called Eden. And the garden was in Eden. Eden was the larger region. And so, and almost every Christian and non-Christian scientists, or a majority of them, believe that the first continent was a supercontinent, which means that there was no 7 continents. It was just one continent. And it was surrounded by water. And some scientists call it Rodinia. This is a depiction of that, where there's one huge supercontinent in the middle. Africa, Asia, South America, North America, Australia, Antarctica are all combined, and then water is, so it's basically a huge island, all right, that eventually broke into parts and broke into the 7 continents over time. And biblical scientists, a lot of biblical scientists believe that Noah's flood is what caused the breakup, because when the Bible describes the flood, it says that the fountains of the great deep opened up. And it gives other descriptions of the flood, which basically indicate that the flood was like a huge earthquake full of tsunamis and possibly volcanoes and tornadoes and meteorite showers. And so it was a huge catastrophe that caused the original island to break into eventually break into these 7 parts that we see today. Okay, and the parts are still moving slowly. That's why we still have earthquakes. And one of the verses that give evidence to this idea is in Genesis 1 verse 9, when God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered to one place." So when you, the understanding here is that everything was in one place. The waters were in one place, like you see here. And like you see here, all the light areas would be water. And then it says, "Let the dry land appear." So the dry land appeared in one place, and the water appeared in one place. It was all, and the tabernacle is similar because the tabernacle is comparable to the earth. Okay? There's a lot of correlation with the tabernacle and the earth. All right? And so, but in the tabernacle, you walk in, you're walking on dirt. But then there's one place, the water laver, where there's water, and the water is in one place. And so Moses, who built the tabernacle, is also the one who wrote Genesis and wrote this verse that says the waters were in one place. All right, so that's evidence for a supercontinent. And here you have a depiction of God creating Adam. And God, in his mind, he has the Hebrew word tselem, which is the word image. And he's creating Adam in his image. And he puts Adam in the supercontinent of Eden, and therefore Adam is an Edenite. He's not an African, he's an Edenite. Okay? What are you going to eat tonight? No, I'm just kidding. But he's an Edenite. All right, so he's placed in Eden, and he owns the earth. All right? Him and his wife. Adam is the first man created by God, and Eve was the second person created by God. They were a black family that owned the earth. And everybody alive today came from them. All right? And so the world history is black history. And eventually their world broke apart. But they still own it. You know, it's just like if your car breaks down, you know, your bumper falls off, it's still yours. You see what I mean? And so this is still black history. We're still living in a black world. All right? And so Adam, the world broke apart. But Eden was still located in Africa after it broke apart. Okay? And so if you look up Eden, now this is relevant to understanding the migration and the demographical evidence for the blackness of Adam. Adam was the first person in Eden. And so that means that all people essentially migrated from Eden. All right? And Eden was part of Africa. Eden was in Africa. The Bible in Genesis chapter 2 describes Eden as in relationship to Euphrates, the Tigris River, Cush, Gihon, etc. And so Cush is obviously African. There is Arabia, that the Cushites also lived in Arabia, right? But they also lived in Africa. Obviously, that's Ethiopia, all right? And so Eden was a huge area that encompassed parts of Africa and parts of modern-day Arabia, and a little bit up here. And so when people say Middle East, they're being deceptive. Because Middle East is not a country, it's not a state, it's not a continent. It's just a word created by whites to bring confusion to the region. So what the way the Bible explains the origin of all people, which are black people, is that we started off in Eden. And even Moses, who was writing about Genesis, was in Africa when he wrote Genesis. He's from Africa. And when he was in Africa, he was living in Egypt during the new Egyptian empire. And if you look up the time of Moses and the time of the new Egyptian empire, during that time, Israel was part of the Egyptian empire. It was still a part of Africa even during the time of Moses, and Moses was almost 3,000 years after Adam. Okay? So which means that before that time, it was definitely part of Africa. So today they want you to forget that. So they call it the Middle East. But if you go back in time, go back to the time of Moses, it was called Africa. It was part of the new Egyptian empire. And you can look that up in secular sources, and they'll also confirm that. Okay? And so Israel is part of Africa, and actually Israel is all on the African plate anyways, even today. So all of these regions are basically African, but Africa is not even the right word, because Africa was created by a white man. The name Africa, not the African continent. The word Africa is a white man's word. The real word, the biblical word, is Eden. Okay? And so Black history starts with Adam and Eve, and Adam was an Edenite. Moving right along. This is another example of the supercontinent in the beginning of time, when God created the world in the beginning. And this is depicted by Answers in Genesis, which is a group of world-class Christian scientists. These are those same guys who replicated the Noah's Ark in Kentucky. So basically, they understand that the world started off as one piece and broke into these stages till eventually it got to where we are today, the 7 continents. All right? And so they believe that as the world broke apart, one of the phases that it went through was known as Pangea. Now, I point that out because a lot of secular books start off with Pangea and then eventually end up with the 7 continents that we have today. All right? But so you're going to find different models, but all the models are basically going to say that the world started off as one big supercontinent island that eventually broke into the 7 continents. All right? That's going to be where they agree. All right? Now, when they broke apart, when the world broke apart, the earth broke apart, it was like an egg that cracked in different places. And every piece of the egg that cracked, every part was named. And so, for example, these little red lines you see here, those are the cracks. And so the North American plate, every piece of the egg is called a plate. All right? So the North American plate is where North America is, the United States. That's why it's called North America. It's on the North American plate. It's correlated properly. All right? South American plate. This is South America, this little small white region here, but it's on the bigger South American plate. Okay, so that's why it's called South America. It's the name of the plate matches the name of the continent. All right. Over here you have the Caribbean plate, and on it is curry chicken. Caribbean, the Caribbean. Okay, and then here you have the Australian plate. And Australia is on the Australian plate. All right. Here you have the Eurasian plate. And what is on that plate? Europe and Asia. Okay. Why do I say that? Why is that important? Because when you get to the African plate, this is the African plate. You have Africa on it. But guess what else is on it? Israel. Israel's on the African plate. So Israel is African. Okay? If North America is on the North American plate and it's called North America, Israel is on the African plate, so that's African. All right? And that's today. So if you go back in time, Arabia was also connected to the African plate, so Arabia is also Africa. So when we say Eden was African, we're talking about Arabia and modern day Africa. We're talking about modern day Arabia and modern day Africa combined and Israel combined to create Eden. All right. So that's the plate tectonic evidence for the blackness of Adam, because Israel, Arabia, and Africa are all in one part. So that's tectonic evidence for the blackness of Adam. But now, looking at the migration maps that show where the first people lived and where they moved to, National Geographic, which is not Christian, will still say that the first people started here in Africa. And then from there they began to move and populate the entire earth until they got to Brazil, South America. Okay? And every continent that they went to, the first people to get to these continents were black. So North America, first people that were here were black. That's why when Christopher Columbus came, he saw the black Indians. And then he said, "Oh, I discovered America." No, he didn't discover anything. He discovered black people who were already there. So it's like if I walk outside and I say I discovered Tesla because I see somebody driving a Tesla. I didn't discover anything. Tesla has already been discovered. You see? And so Chris didn't discover anything. Every continent was discovered by a black person. All of the 7 continents except for Antarctica, because nobody lives there. But every continent was, the first people on every continent were black. All right? Every continent, including Europe, Asia, Australia, all the so-called white places. Every place was started off with blacks. And like I said, we love everybody. We don't hate white people or anything like that. We're just telling you the truth right now, and white people already know this, and so they need to basically stop lying and be honest. If you're Christian, I'm not talking to non-Christians, but I'm saying as Christians, stop deceiving black people. Okay? If you're all about the truth, proclaim that. All right? So this is just one migration map from National Geographic. There's another map. It starts off, the oldest person is 200,000 years old from the evidence that they found using DNA from bones, archaeological evidence, all the different evidences that they find in order to create this map. According to them, the oldest person is 200,000 years ago, and then they have people 1,000 years ago. So the bottom line is the dates, 1,000, 50,000, 200,000. You're going to see other maps that say millions. You're going to see other maps that say thousands. But all of them are going to agree that the oldest person starts off in Africa. The original people start off in Africa. That's where they're all going to agree. The time frames are all over the map. But the origin of the first man and woman, Africa. All right? So this is a separate map. Here's another map saying the same thing with slightly different numbers. Oldest number, 200,000 years ago, where? Africa. They migrate, they go to all the 7 continents, they cross this land bridge here, they get to North America, bam. And then they go down, end in Brazil. And then you have 12,000 years ago, according to their numbers. But their biggest number is 200,000 years ago, because they're saying that the oldest bones they found, or people that they found, or whatever, was in Africa. All right. There's another map saying the same thing. This map is from Harvard. Harvard University says that history started in Africa. Okay, so once again, world history is black history according to the Harvard studies. And it ends in South America, Brazil. Brazil is still predominantly black. Why is that? Because the first people of Brazil were black. Okay, and so there you have it. So now another piece of evidence basically has to do with fossils. So fossils are anything that's alive when it dies and it gets covered in layers. Allegedly, it gets squished and pressured and eventually turns into this black stuff here that they call oil. And then, so therefore, places that have the most death and that has been there the longest, creating enough pressure on this oil, the more oil you find, the older the place, because more things died there to creating more oil. And so one of the oil maps, this place on Earth should have the most fossils and the most oil. And based off of this map, real quick, you can see that the blackest places are the places with the most oil. That means the most things died there. And so that probably means that these places were filled with people the longest. This could be where, after Adam and Eve, Noah could have migrated over here, and then Noah's flood could have started over here. So the bottom line is that it's in the region, in the ballpark of where Eden would be, which gives evidence to the blackness of Adam. Now, of course, we have a counter example here in Venezuela, because this area also has a lot of oil. And we don't know why, except that it makes perfect sense for Trump to take this place, because they're in war and they need oil. I mean, I don't know if that's the reason. I'm just saying, it seems it's interesting. And then also, Iran is right here. It's also next to a lot of oil. So, those could just be total coincidences. And I'm not pretending as if the Democrats or Republicans are good godly examples of politics. Both sides are sinful examples of how to do politics, and both sides have good in them, And so, from God's point of view, you don't really take a side, because the Bible calls that a clique. So a clique is like when you take a side, regardless of the good or bad in your side. That's a clique. So it's like you have a group of friends and you don't care if they're wrong, you're still gonna click with them. If they're right, you're gonna no. The biblical way is when your friends are wrong, you correct them, and you let them know that that was wrong, and you do not affirm their sin. So if you're a Republican and you see a bunch of racist Republicans, you need to confront that. If you're godly, if you're Christian, and if you're Democrat and you see a bunch of liberal, gay promoting Democrats, you need to confront that. All right? But when you see a Republican that says, hey, I believe in religious freedom, you need to affirm that. And when you see a Democrat who says you need to love the foreigner, you need to affirm that. That's the Christian way. The Christian affirms goodness regardless of whose side the goodness comes from, and they condemn evil regardless of whose side the evil comes from. All right? But the point here is that this is fossil evidence for the blackness of Adam. Now, the last point is that every indigenous person was black. That means the first South American was black, the first American or North American person was a black person. Christopher Columbus didn't discover anything. We understand that. He found black Indians here. The first people in Australia were black. That's well known. The first Africans and the majority of Africans to this day are still black. The first Asians were black. first Europeans were black. The first British was a black man. Okay, so like if you go to London today and you go into the London Museum, the National History Museum in London, you're gonna find this depiction here. You're gonna find this reconstruction of one of the first Brits. All right, and so when they found the bones of this man, they took the DNA from their bones and they got hard DNA evidence that he was a dark-haired man with brown skin and blue eyes. And he's one of the first Brits. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the first white man from Britain, from London, is a black man. The first white man is a black man. You think about that. Amen.
Hey, yo, Ray.